Good evening. It's time for us to begin our Wednesday night continuation of the series Luke's been doing this week for us. And we've been talking about the Old Testament quite a bit and people of the Old Testament period. And so I think Luke's switching gears tonight. The lesson tonight is Did Jesus Exist? The Archaeology of the Messiah and His Time. So we're going to be talking about New Testament archaeological activities and discoveries. And so switch gears a little bit and come into a little bit more of the modern times. Hope that you all are enjoying this. I know I've been enjoying the series, and Luke is just throwing out all kinds of good information for us. Also, if you're listening and you aren't aware, all the lessons are the church has a channel on YouTube called Jamestown COC for Church of Christ. So if you go to Jamestown COC on YouTube, you can find all of the lessons of this week and other weeks as well that are recorded there that you can post. If you would bow with me for a moment of prayer, then I'll hand it over to Luke tonight. We can learn more about them and learn about how that they are corroborated through external evidences. Thankful for Luke and his expertise and his willingness to share the things that he has learned, and that it brings benefit to us and helps us understand the times and the culture and the things of the New Testament to help us understand it more fully and then make a better application of it to our own lives. We ask you to be with us this hour. We ask it in Christ's name. Amen. Luke, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session tonight. As Mark mentioned, we're going to go into the time of Jesus. Most of the archaeology that's around just quantitatively deals with the Old Testament period, because the Old Testament period is so long. There's so many centuries, 1,500, 2,000 years. But if we start with Abraham, we're talking 2,000 years-ish before Jesus. And so you're going to find a lot more just materially from such a long period of time. The time of Jesus and the apostles is less than a century. I guess you can round it to a century. So there's just not as much in a century, under normal terms. But what a century, because the Romans are in charge, and the Romans have pacified the world. And instead of using money and taxes and manpower to field massive armies and fight destructive wars, in the time of Jesus and the apostles, for the most part, the world is at peace. And resources and people can be devoted to other kinds of things, like monuments and infrastructure and those kinds of wonderful things. And so in that century that we will put Jesus in, that century, Jesus and the apostles, there is a lot for that century. Many centuries in the Old Testament had little or nothing because they were in something of a dark age or a great decline in civilization or in peace. But the century of Jesus has quite a bit. And some of Jesus' greatest enemies are responsible for so much of what we find in archaeology, like Herod the Great. He was a tremendous builder, wanted to be the biggest builder since Solomon. And he may have pulled that off, actually, and maybe even more, to tell you the truth. We find Herod's footprint archaeologically everywhere in that land. And some of his things are still standing today, strong and true, and they frame our picture and our readings of the New Testament and shape our understanding of the time of Jesus. As we go into this, I'll just remind everyone that at the end of this session, we will have a chance for questions and answers. And so if you have a question along the way, make a note of it, send it as a chat, or at the end, you can use the raising hand feature in Zoom if you're on Zoom, and those will be moderated, and we can get to several of those questions, perhaps yours, as we have time. So let's get right to it and not take any more of your time. what we will do, let me start my presentation. And okay, hopefully you see that beautiful shot of sunrise on the Sea of Galilee. And if you've been over there, that's a popular thing to do. To most people, most Christians who go spend a night or two by the Sea of Galilee and get up to take pictures like this. But anyway, that's not archaeology. That's photography, which can be used in archaeology. That's not what this is. Now let's go on. Jesus. So the setting, we picture a lot of Galilee, beautiful things. So lilies of the field, flowers, and rolling hills, and it's all accurate. The Sermon on the Mount, and we picture the lake, the Sea of Galilee down below, and the bustling area and its natural beauty, and it's all true. And if you go around the Sea of Galilee, in many ways, you're seeing what they saw, even today. Go down south, and it looks very different in many places, but not around Galilee. But we're talking about archaeology. So let's ask this question. Archaeology is looking for human remains, physical human remains, or not human remains. Let's clarify that. Physical remains left by humans. Okay, sometimes we do find human remains, but not that often. But what do we do? What are we looking for with Jesus? Did Jesus build anything? No. Physically, did he build anything that would last? No, he built things, I guess, before his ministry with his dad, but those aren't things that are likely to remain. And if we found one of those things they built, I doubt it would be signed, built by Jesus. And that wouldn't necessarily tell us much anyway, as we'll find out in just a minute, even if we found his name on something built by Jesus or Joseph. Now, where do we look? Jesus didn't really come to leave behind physical things, at least that could be identified with him. If you're looking for a king, kings have monuments. They often put their names on them, and they look royal. We can date them to their reign, sometimes very exactly, but at least more or less. And so it's easy to recognize things associated with Nebuchadnezzar or Hezekiah or pharaohs of Egypt, things like that, people like that. But Jesus, a common laborer, and then just walking around teaching, not constructing anything physical, not leaving monuments. I mean, look at his lifestyle, everything we know. What would he leave that we could recognize in archaeology if we found it? And the answer is maybe nothing. Is Jesus archaeologically invisible? Not entirely. We'll find out what I mean by that. But where do we look? What would we expect to find for Jesus? And since he didn't build anything that we would recognize, and likely anything physical that survived, is this a pointless pursuit? Not really. Well, can we even archaeologically affirm Jesus' existence? Some people have questioned whether he even existed. And they are a minority, but there are some people who doubt his existence, who are skeptical. And some of them are actually scholars who should know better, who've actually had training on how to do things. I mean, no one doubts Julius Caesar existed, do they? Of course not. We have tons of things written about him, things purported to have been written by him. And of course, the impact of his life. He conquered Gaul, France today. He conquered that for the Romans, and he left a lasting impact on the political and social structure of Rome and its empire. And if he didn't do it, then who did? I mean, someone did, and everyone tells us it was him. So no one questions it. There's no other candidate for the things he did, and everyone understands that. So why question Jesus? I guess because Jesus calls us to a moral position. He has moral authority, claims moral authority. Julius Caesar, doesn't matter. You can believe in him and still do whatever you want. Believing in Julius Caesar doesn't affect anything about our lives. Just an intellectual acknowledgement, nothing more. Doesn't make any impact otherwise on us. But Jesus does. And so I think that's part of the reason some people try to deny him or to deny even his existence, is because he has an impact. If he did exist and if his teachings are true, then that changes everything. And so some people are inclined to go the other way. But what can we find that may answer those relatively small number of people, or even just give us something positive to go with our faith? We have faith in Jesus, but can we actually find any reason to, yeah, he existed. Are you not sure? Well, here's why you should believe it. And how do we do that? Because he didn't likely leave anything physical for us to dig up. And so can we do it? Well, some have tried, but it doesn't go well. For example, back in 2007, a filmmaker named Simcha Jakobovich and another filmmaker, a minor, a relatively obscure figure you may have heard of, named James Cameron, made a movie about the Titanic and a movie called Avatar, and is working with Disney on 3 Avatar sequels as we speak. James Cameron, I think he did the Terminator movies. He's done a lot of famous movies. Whether you've seen them or not, you've probably heard his name. He's involved in this. It's a tomb that was found back in the 70s in a neighborhood of south of Jerusalem called Talpiot. And so it's called the Talpiot tomb for the neighborhood it was found in. And when they were building an apartment building back in the 70s, they found an ancient tomb. They sent in an archaeologist to do a quick excavation and record everything before they built over it. And that happened. Well, in the 2000s, some filmmakers got a hold of this information and partnered with an actual archaeologist and presented it and made a documentary for TV called, the Family Tomb of Jesus, the Secret Tomb of Jesus, or something like that. And it sounds tantalizing. But what it is, it's a tomb from the Roman period, around the time of Jesus, near Jerusalem. And inside are a bunch of things called ossuaries, or that's an ossuary. And they're bone boxes. In a tomb back then, Jews in that time would lay the body out, and after a year, they'd come back when the body had decayed, and they'd take the bones and put them in one of these boxes to free up space for other bodies. I mean, that's how it worked. It was a family tomb, but how many people can you fit before you run out of room on benches? So you relocate people after a year into these boxes, and you write the name on the box of whoever's inside. And sometimes more than one person, ended up in the same box. Caiaphas in the New Testament, we found his bone box in a tomb, and he had a woman or two buried with him, probably his daughters from the study of the bones. But these are very common, these ossuaries, these bone boxes, and this tomb had several, and there are several inscribed names, and just look at the list and see if it catches your attention. One box was labeled Jesus, son of Joseph. Oh, yes. Now we see where it gets our attention. There's also one box with someone named Mary, a box with someone, Mattia, which is a shortened version of Matthew, Yossi, which is a shortened form of the name Joseph. There's someone in there named Judah, son of Jesus, and there's someone, Mariamna Umara. And Mariamna is a version of Miriam, a Bible name, a good Hebrew name. It's a Greek version of that, a Greekified or Hellenized version of Miriam. And Mara, we'll talk about that. But you look at those names, and of course you think, whoa, Jesus, son of Joseph, and Mary, and there's a Joseph too. And so some people wondered, is this a group of people associated with Jesus? Could this be Jesus himself? And so this documentary reported that archaeologically, we have confirmed Jesus, and we have his tomb right here. Now, of course, we see the Bible teaches that Jesus did not stay in the tomb in which he was placed, that he rose up after 3 days, and they never could locate him in a tomb after that. In fact, it wasn't even his own family's tomb. It was someone else's family, a guy named Joseph, but not, it was Joseph of Arimathea. Anyway, so a lot of people latched onto this. Well, Jesus did exist, but this story about him rising from the dead is just not believable, because we're scientists and we know how the world works, and it's a great story, inspirational for a lot of people. But here we found a tomb, and look at all the names. They're names associated with Jesus. And so is this his tomb? And it can sound very compelling. And the documentary made arguments, making a point that this probably is, in fact, almost has to be And we're not going to go into all their arguments for the sake of time, but let me just point out a few problems with assuming this is the family tomb of Jesus. Aside from the resurrection, let's say someone doesn't believe in the resurrection, doesn't know what to believe about it, and they present us with this. Hey, I remember this documentary. It says this. What do you have to say about that, Christians? Here are a few things just to keep in mind. All these names were very common in that time. Jesus, Joseph, Mary, all these names were very common, and we find them frequently. In fact, as far as Mary, according to inscriptions and writings we have, it seems that possibly up to 25% of the women in that time period were named Mary or some version of Mary. And think how many Marys are there in the Gospels? I think if we count them all, we have about a half dozen Marys in the Gospels. In the New Testament, Mary, mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, there's Mary as in Mary and Martha, and there are some others who are a little more obscure, but still named in the New Testament. So that would support that. There are a lot of Marys running around. And so that name itself is extremely common. And Joseph, Jesus, Judah, Matthew, they were among the top 10 most popular names for men in that period. We found them in writings and documents and inscriptions, extremely common names. So let's point that out first of all. Finding the name Jesus, or the Hebrew or the Aramaic or Hebrew version of it, isn't a big deal. In fact, Jesus, son of Joseph, we found that combination, Jesus, son of Joseph, on two other ossuaries at different places. Two other tombs have bone boxes with someone named Jesus, the son of Joseph. So this would make three of them we found. So is it so unusual? And we found the name Jesus on 99 in all. So it's extremely common. The archaeologist who excavated all these originally, his name is Amos Cloner. He passed away recently, but a few years ago. But he has a quote after this documentary came out. He said, "Wait a minute, I excavated this back in the 70s. You're saying this now? It makes a great story for a TV film, but there's no likelihood that Jesus and his relatives had a family tomb. They were a Galilee family with no ties in Jerusalem. Think about it. In the gospel, where is Jesus raised? Up in Nazareth, in Galilee. When Jesus interacts with his mother or his brothers or anything in the gospels, where does it happen? It's always up in Galilee. Now, when he is crucified, Mary is down there near Jerusalem with him, but it's Passover. People often travel down during Passover. And so that's nothing unusual. They're a Galilee family. Why would they have a family tomb near Jerusalem? It contradicts everything we know about this particular Jesus. And since there were others named Jesus, whose dad was also named Joseph, there's no reason to assume this is Jesus' family tomb. There's a burden of proof. If you're going to claim it's Jesus' family tomb, then you need to prove it. Yet a big claim requires big evidence, and this just doesn't have it. And so it's a made-for-TV thing to get ratings and get money, get out there. That illustrates one of the problems with the media and the Bible, or archaeology, I should say. Not all media is the same. Some are better, some are worse. But a lot of the things we see in a documentary or a video series with archaeology, people making the decisions are not, people making the editing and production decisions are not archaeologists. They're TV or media people. And they go through a different process. We'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow night. We just need to be careful when we see things that look compelling. In fact, a lot of the time, it's not as it really is presented. And when you're making a media thing, you want people to watch it. And not that often gets in the way of, is this really so? And so anyway, well, where else could we go to look for Jesus? We're not going to find a tomb, and some have tried, and there's a problem. This is a picture of modern Bethlehem. And the hill of Bethlehem, the hill that you associate with David, with Ruth, the town that sat right up there back in those times. We've excavated part of it from the time of the Old Testament. But not many people go there and see those ruins. But the Church of the Nativity is a thing that a lot of people who go to Israel visit. And it marks the traditional place where Jesus was born. Okay, there's some archaeology there. It's an ancient place, Jesus' birth. And if you've been there, you might recognize this view. This building itself is an artifact. This particular structure dates to the 500s AD, built by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. And so the building itself is about 1,500 years old. That's impressive. but it doesn't look like a church building like we'd usually think of it. And of course, we can tell it's old. You go inside and you go down to the basement, and actually, the building was built on top of a cave. And the cave, according to tradition, is where Jesus was born. That tradition, it pops up in the 200s, 300s AD, a few hundred years after Jesus' birth. And so we don't really have any record or tradition going back closer than that. So it's really hard to know whether it is. I'm skeptical that we can really know. Some people think it really may be and makes sense. And it does make sense if you assume some things, but there's a big war at the end of the first century with the Romans and the Jews. Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed, and then about 50 years later, there's another war between the Romans and Jews, highly destructive. And in the south, in Judah in particular, and the Romans banned all Jews from the region for a long time, and a lot of Christians would have been banned as well. And with all the destruction and the loss of local memory, how much trust can we put in stories that pop up later? It's a question to debate. We really don't know. But this picture is actually a cave. You can't really tell anymore because it's been built and hewed and hacked and shaped into a tourist destination and a place for some people to pray. This is purportedly where Jesus was born. And this little star, that metal star on the floor, is supposed to mark the place where he was actually born. Of course, is this archaeology? No. These are people centuries later making shrines. And there's no archaeology here. There's no excavation. There's no analysis of finds. And what would we find here that would prove or affirm that Jesus was born here? I mean, you're not going to find anything physical, are you? Even if you did excavate, what would you find? If you find a manger somewhere, by the way, the manger is supposedly over here. And there is a record from an early pilgrim of there being a feeding trough, a manger over there, at least the outlines of one. But they're very common, in caves and sheepfolds. So having one in a cave doesn't mean it's the one. It's tradition. But if we're looking for archaeology for Jesus, this is not archaeology that can tell us anything about whether Jesus existed or not. It's a cave that people later on believed Jesus was born in, but this was generations after Jesus' time. It doesn't help. It doesn't tell us anything, doesn't affirm anything. These shrines don't archaeologically demonstrate anything for us. So for the question, did Jesus exist? They're not helpful. They don't tell us anything. So what do we do? Well, let's go to Nazareth, where he grew up. Here's Nazareth today. Back in Jesus' time, it was a small town, maybe even a village. There's some debate over the size, but nothing like this. This is modern Nazareth. It's a city with tens of thousands of people. And the ancient first century Nazareth is under that somewhere, under a portion of that somewhere. And the problem with doing archaeology is that you have to tear down other things to even get to it, to get the first century remains. And people don't usually want to have their homes torn down, their businesses leveled, so you can go digging for scraps. So there's not a whole lot of archaeology taking place there. The town's been continuously occupied since Jesus' time. So there's not really a great opportunity for archaeology there. And even if you did archaeology, what would you find? Find a random house. Hey, is this the house of Jesus and Joseph and Mary? We have no way to know. Even if we find some of those names, weren't they extremely common names? How many people in Nazareth were named Mary? And maybe one out of every 4 women. So that's not going to help us. And Jesus and Joseph, 99 inscriptions with the name Jesus. So that doesn't really lock anything in for us, even if we did find something like that. So Nazareth, we really can't dig there, anything significant anyway, just little bits here and there that don't really tell us much. What we expect to find, good luck. Nazareth is not really archaeologically a place to look for Jesus. So here you go again. Can we archaeologically connect it to Jesus in any way? He didn't build anything. The places he grew up, his birth, they don't help us with anything. They don't really tell us anything. They're traditions, or they're buried under modern cities. Well, we cannot affirm Jesus archaeologically through physical objects, but if you count ancient documents like scrolls or ancient writings, literary sources, those count as archaeology. And if someone says, oh, wait, that's history. Yeah, but it also can be archaeology. Dead Sea Scrolls, anybody? Dead Sea Scrolls are historical documents, but they're found through archaeology. And a lot of the ancient documents we found over time. Copies of this or that have come through archaeological work. If it's an ancient document, it's an object from ancient times. It can tell us a lot of things, not just what the words tell us. We can analyze the ink, analyze the paper or whatever it's written on. We can scan it and see if things are written there before. If it's faded, we can do scans and often recover lost letters through chemical analysis. The ink was here and not there. Chemically, you can't see it visually, but chemically you can detect it and restore lost writing, which is incredible. Documents do overlap with archaeology. And so from that perspective, we do have some things to include. First of all, there's a Roman historian named Tacitus. He was a politician and a historian, lived at the end of the 1st century after Christ and the beginning of the 2nd century. So a couple generations afterward. And he wrote some histories. And he talks about Nero, the emperor in the 60s, late 50s and the 60s in Rome, and how he was the first Roman emperor to start targeting Christians. There's a great fire of Rome that burned down huge sections of the city, and a lot of people thought Nero was responsible for it. And Tacitus talks about what happened. Let's just look at this section here that Tacitus writes down. Talking about Nero trying to get people to think he didn't do it. But says, neither human effort nor the emperor's generosity could end the scandalous belief that the fire had been ordered by Nero. Therefore, to put down the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished in the most unusual ways those hated for their shameful acts, whom the crowd called Christians. The founder of this name, Christus, had been executed in the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate. Suppressed for a time, the deadly superstition erupted again, not only in Judea, the origin of this evil, but also in the city of Rome, where all things horrible and shameful from everywhere come together and become popular. You can see some social commentary in there as well. Everything works its way to Rome, and the young people just latch on these crazy ideas from other places and shameful acts, and they become popular, and Rome suffers for it. Anyway, but you notice some things in here. And we all recognize some of those names and what he's talking about, a group called Christians. He's writing in Latin, so some spellings change. And the founder of this name, Christus, that's, we recognize the word Christ in there, don't we? But he's writing it as a Latin name. And it talks about how Pilate executed this person called Christus, but his movement, what does he tell us? Several points. Tacitus, who is no friend of these Christians, these terrible things they brought to Rome, Christianity, he confirms in his writing, it originated with someone he calls Christus, which is a Latin version of the Greek word Christos, which is Messiah, Christ, the anointed one. And he took that Greek word and made it a Latin name. And he doesn't care that much to investigate all those little tiny details. Is it a name? Is it a title? Whatever. That's the name they throw around, so I'll just Latinize it, and Christus. And this guy, Christus, was executed by Pilate, who this guy affirms existed. And the movement, he says, after it was squelched initially, it did end up spreading to Rome from Judea. And so you see how much of the Bible Tacitus is affirming for us, confirming. He does not question whether this Christus existed. He assumes, of course, he existed. And interestingly, neither Tacitus, of all the early enemies of Christianity, there were a lot of enemies, and some of them wrote in the 2nd and 3rd centuries and so on. But no one ever doubted that Jesus existed. None of the enemies, the early enemies of Christianity, ever questioned Jesus' existence. That's a much more recent thing. All of the enemies of Christians believed he did exist, including Tacitus, who lived during the lifetime of some people whose lives overlapped Jesus. He doesn't question his existence. He accepts it easily. It's not Jesus who has issues. It's Christus. He in his criticism of Christians and Nero trying to make them the scapegoats, he ends up confirming all these points that the Bible tells us about Christians. Now, Tacitus was not just some author. I told you earlier he was a proconsul, like a governor or a politician over an area for a time. And he had access to governmental archives. And if he or anyone else for that matter wanted to question whether Jesus, this Christus, ever existed, it would be easy to do. So all they would need to do is go check their archives. The Romans kept records of everything, and Caesarea was the Roman capital of Judea, Galilee, and all the records were kept there. Someone could have easily gone there and checked through Pontius Pilate's reports. Here's an execution. Did it actually happen? Wait, there was no execution in that time period by anyone named, Jesus. That what the Christians are saying about Pilate killing this guy, it's a lie. There's no record of it. No, there was a record. If there wasn't a record, it would have been so easy to prove that Jesus was a fake, that he never existed. But they could never do that. So Tacitus, with his access to records and all the other enemies out there who tried all sorts of ways to suppress and attack Christians, none of them ever doubted Jesus existed. And if Jesus had never existed, it would have been so easy to prove. Does that not tell us anything? All these records that they kept, no one could ever state that Jesus never existed. Of course he did. And all the enemies acknowledged that. One more source that a lot of us have heard of, a guy named Josephus. He was a Jewish writer, not a Christian, never became a Christian. He lived in the 1st century. He was a priest who got caught up in the first war against Rome and became a general against the Romans, leading Jews, before he was captured by the Romans, then switched sides, and the Roman general Vespasian, who later became Caesar, took him in and became his patron. And Josephus wrote some very famous volumes about Jews and their history. But in one passage of his book, Antiquities, Josephus is talking about events during the book of Acts. He doesn't call it the book of Acts, but during that same time period in Jerusalem. And he talks about the high priest Annas, who was mentioned in the Gospels. And he didn't like Annas. Josephus doesn't like Annas. He's talking about, conniving and secret plots and conspiracies and power plays. He says in his book 20 of Antiquities about Annas, being this kind of person, some rigid, harsh Sadducee, Annas, thinking he had a favorable opportunity because the governor Festus had died and Albinus's replacement was still on the way, Annas called a meeting of judges and brought into it the brother of Jesus, who is called Messiah, James by name, and some others. He made the accusation they'd transgressed the law, and he handed them over to be stoned. Who did he just mention here? He mentions Annas bringing in a prominent guy named James, and he was the brother of that guy Jesus, who some called Messiah. See, he mentions Jesus here. His focus is not Jesus, but he mentions Jesus to tell us which James it is. And the process, there are a lot of people named Jesus as well. He mentions Jesus, the one who many called who was called Messiah. Doesn't say Josephus believes he was the Messiah, just that Jesus was called that. That's what he's known for. Some people called him that. And this guy's brother was brought in and stoned to death. So here we have Josephus talking about the murder of Jesus' physical brother James. But what does he do? He mentions Jesus. And Josephus lived in the same century as Jesus, just a few decades later. And it's common knowledge. The people who wrote this for, the Jews, knew these names as reference points. He believed Jesus existed. And there's another passage in the 18th book before this, which is famous but also problematic. Here's the full text. Josephus wrote, around this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. He was one who did surprising deeds, a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who in the first place came to love him did not give up their affection for him. For on the 3rd day he appeared to them restored to life. The prophets of God had prophesied this and countless other marvelous things about him. And the tribe of Christians, so called after him, have still to this day not died out. Okay, some of those phrases are in italics, and there's a reason for it. We look at this, and it's pretty praiseworthy of Jesus, calling him the Messiah. If he should even be called a man, he seems to be so much more, and talking about him resurrecting and appearing to people. Now, Josephus was not a Christian. He was a Jew, full and through, so much of a Jew that he went to war for Jewish independence against Rome. And would he write those things? A lot of people think that later editors inserted some phrases to be more respectful of Jesus. In the italics, one scholar recently read through it and very familiar with Josephus and the way Josephus writes about people. And he identified phrases that were probably added or sound like they'd been added. But when you take it out and you read what this gentleman, Lawrence Mikiduk, believes was closer to the original text, it reads just like Josephus writes about a lot of people. It takes out indications that he might be divine or the Messiah, which Josephus probably did not believe at all. But he talks about someone who was prominent in that time, did deeds, and Pilate condemned him to be crucified, and the tribe of Christians carrying his name are still around. Now that, it's Josephus mentions him. And if we have disputes about exactly what the phrasing was, there's little doubt he still mentioned him. And 2 books later, Josephus mentions him again. The Jesus called Messiah and brother of James. James is the one being talked about then. He was the brother of this guy I mentioned earlier, Jesus called Messiah. And so Josephus mentions Jesus as well, among a lot of other people he mentioned in that time who were prominent. So what do we have here? We found some copies of these guys' writings in excavations. Some of their copies have been preserved in libraries too, a long time. They're copied, but this is a form of archaeology, and neither of them were Christians. Neither of them believed in Jesus, and yet look at all the points that they confirm. Jesus lived in Judea with Pilate. He had a brother named James. He was unpopular with the Jewish leaders, though some people did call him Messiah, which in Greek is Christos, and you can Latinize it to Christus, like Tacitus did. After being judged and crucified by Pilate, his movement attracted Jews and Gentiles, and it spread all the way to Rome. And so look what these guys end up confirming for us. Tacitus and Josephus, 2 non-believers, confirm all these points about Jesus and his existence. No one questioned it in that time. So why question it today? If someone tries to doubt he existed today, take him back to Tacitus and Josephus and all the other enemies of Christ, all of whom accepted his existence and could have easily proven any claim otherwise. If Jesus had been made up, that idea would have been killed in the bud, nipped in the bud, because it would have been so easy to disprove. Now let's understand the limits of archaeology, though. Was Jesus divine? Was he the Son of God? Archaeology cannot answer that. It's beyond the scope of archaeology to deal with that kind of a question. That's a question of faith. But we have every reason on earth to believe that Jesus lived on earth. There is no reason to question that. To do so, to question or doubt whether Jesus physically existed, is not based on archaeology or anything else. It's just a willful choice and nothing more. The evidence is strong, and stronger for Jesus' existence than for a lot of other people's existence. Even his enemies accepted it and beyond. Well, let's go on. Archaeologically, we really can't do more as far as did Jesus exist, but we can do that, and we have that. But can archaeology help us any more with Jesus? And it can. The Gospels talk about a lot of the details in Jesus' ministry, in his life. Geographical locations, conditions, political situations, and so on. There's a lot of it in the Gospels. And archaeology has told us a lot about that time period. There's been a lot of archaeology about the 1st century. And what it does is it paints the picture of where Jesus was and what he did and why things happened the way they did. And it is very consistent with the Bible. So let's look at just a few things. Here before we conclude our time tonight. One place we're going to go is Magdala. And if you've been to Israel in recent years, you may have visited this place. It's the town where Mary the Magdalene was likely from, hence her name. Names, the second name of a person, if they have one, often is not their last name, it's where they're from. And Mary of Magdala. Magdala was a town right there. You see the dotted lines going across the map. Those are the highways. Look at one coming in from the left, from Sepphoris. That's a highway. It's a branch of the Via Maris, the Way of the Sea, a hugely popular interstate route that went from Egypt all the way to Mesopotamia and all that. And it went right by the Sea of Galilee, this branch of it did. And it went right by Magdala, in fact. And we can imagine with the roads, a lot of caravans and travelers would come across the hot, the summertime, the hot, dry area around Galilee, June, July, August heat. And they come to Magdala at the end of a long day of walking, and it's right there by a freshwater lake, drinking water and maybe a place to sleep for the night, an inn and restaurants and a place to put your feet up and feel the cool breeze as the sun goes down, and spend the night at one of your interstate exits at Magdala. Popular place, a lot of people going through there. And Jesus would have gone through there too, walking these routes, walking these highways in his ministry. Well, there's been some archaeology there recently, and we found a synagogue that dates to the first half of the first century, the time of Jesus. How can we date it that securely? The first half of the first century? It's not carbon-14 or pottery this time. Though the pottery does put it in the first century. They found coins. And the coins in there were of leaders who ruled in the first half of the first century. And then everything was destroyed. We don't find coins from later periods. So the coins help date this building very exactly for us. This building was around during Jesus' ministry, this synagogue. And it's very likely Jesus was here because the Gospels tell us that Jesus went throughout all Galilee preaching and teaching in the synagogues. This is on the most popular highway in Galilee. And can we imagine that he would not have visited this Galilee synagogue right there off the highway? And that's not 100%, but it's, can we say it's in the 90s, 90 percentile something? It's very likely he was in this very room and stood there between those columns teaching. And one thing this does, it shows us what synagogues looked like. You look around the edges, you can see benches in the far wall. People sat on benches. That area, but those columns show there is a second level to the synagogue. They hold up a second floor, like where the women sat. The women sat on the second floors of these synagogues. We know that much, and men were on the bottom. So they were separated. But women could be in there too, but usually on the top level, separate from the men. But the speaker or the reader stood in the middle, where that little stone table looking thing is there. It's a replica of the original. And they would read from the Bible and talk, and people would sit all around them, 360, all four sides. And that's the layout. We know that because we found several synagogues, and they all in that time had the same layout. It wasn't like our church auditoriums typically are, someone in front of the whole room and everyone else in benches, facing. The speaker was surrounded by the community people in the synagogue. And Jesus was likely in this one. Look at the floor, mosaic tile floor, and that's the original pattern, So we can get a picture of what these places were like when Jesus is in a synagogue. This appears to have been a typical one in that time. And Jesus may have even walked on this very floor. We don't know 100%. Maybe it was added after his ministry. Maybe he walked on it. Maybe he walked on the other side of the room only for some reason. We don't know, but it really is intriguing to think about that, isn't it? And that doorway I'm standing in, it's not actually where the doorway was originally located. It's been reconstructed. The synagogue was totally destroyed, likely by the Romans in the First War. And but when they reconstructed, they put the doorway here. But those stones for the doorway would have been in a different location, but those are the same stones, we believe. So we can see the synagogue behind, and we can get more of a picture of what it would have looked like. So it helps give us a picture. There's another synagogue in a place called Gamla, and not many tourists go to this one because to get to it, you have to park and you have to walk a trail a little bit, and you have to walk back up the trail. And it's not just a flat, even trail. It's a little bit challenging. Most people can handle it no problem. I took a group there a few years ago and a couple of years ago, and almost everyone had no problem. If you couldn't walk down there to the synagogue, there are plenty of beautiful places to watch and sit. There's a place selling coffee and things like that. But here's another synagogue, and this one doesn't get as much tourist traffic, but look at it. You see the same layout. There are some columns. It might be a little bit bigger inside. You see benches going around, and these are all original. It's possible Jesus visited this one. We don't know for sure, but it's possible he was here too. But this is, when we picture Jesus in a synagogue, this is the kind of building he was in. We found several examples, and this is probably the best preserved one overall in the whole country from the first century, from that time period. And if you get a chance to go there, the most tours, again, do not go there. But if you get a chance and you can, I recommend you do it because it's what it really puts you there. And you're seeing the kinds of things that Jesus saw. And you can easily see it in your mind's eye. Of course, a famous place, Capernaum, and we've done some archaeology here. We know Jesus was there. In fact, he even relocated there for a while. It became his base, his hometown. He'd go out from Capernaum, teach in the area, and come back there and sleep and stay for a while. The town itself doesn't exist anymore. It's all fields, but the property's been bought, and there has been some archaeology there. And what we have found is intriguing. Some things about it. Capernaum actually is the Hebrew name is Kfar Nahum, village of Nahum. Oh, is it the Nahum? I'll tell you, we don't know. It could be, we have no idea. It could be a local guy named Nahum who established the village or was very prominent at one point. It might be the prophet Nahum. We just have no way to know. But Capernaum is, carry over a couple languages, and the pronunciation changes, but it means village of Nahum. Jesus lived there. He didn't just visit. He left Nazareth and moved to Capernaum in Matthew 4:13. So it's not just a town Jesus passed through several times. He actually lived there and used it as a base during his ministry. And he had a house there, which the Bible mentions. 5 of his apostles were encountered there. Peter and Andrew, originally from Bethsaida, which is the other side of the Jordan River, but it was a different political district. And you probably had to pay a tax every time you crossed the border. So they moved over there to Capernaum, possibly because the fishing was better there and they didn't have to pay tax anymore if they lived there. James and John are fishermen there. And Matthew ran the tax office, it looks like, or had a tax office there, maybe collecting that border tax, among other kinds of taxes. So 5 apostles were in Capernaum when Jesus got them. And a border town, a tax office, there's a garrison there, the centurion, and that centurion, at least one of the centurions, makes an appearance in the Gospels even, with that garrison in that border town. You have a garrison there just to keep an eye on things, watch the road, and guard the border if anything happens. These guys play in the Bible story. We have a lot of miracles recorded in Canaan, and you can see a list of them here, the ones that we know of. And some of these we'll mention particularly. But the shoreline, today it's ruins, but this possibly along this very section of shore where James and John were cleaning their nets, and Jesus called them. They left their nets and followed Jesus. And so that may have happened right in this view right here, possibly. It's not a big area, and so everything's so close together over there. It's fascinating. But the archaeology uncovered something quite interesting. And if you go to Capernaum, you see this. This is probably the most memorable thing there. The limestone synagogue. Everything else is dark stone, different kind of stone. This is limestone imported from somewhere else because limestone doesn't occur naturally in this part of the country. They brought it in sometime in the 3rd, 4th, or 5th centuries, and there's a huge synagogue built, beautiful. This is largely restored, rebuilt. When it was excavated, all this was in ruins. But what about this? Jesus did stuff in the synagogue, yes, but this was built a few centuries after Jesus' time. True, but if you look under it, here's the inside of that synagogue from later centuries. But if you look at the foundations, you'll see that the foundations don't line up exactly. Look at those dark stones. See how they kind of they're out of line. They're off the line from the limestone, from the white stones. Here's a picture from the other end looking back this way. You can see it more easily here. They're not lined up exactly right. Now archaeologists dug under the limestone and found the earlier building. And there's a section where you can see one of those squares. But they were actually, this building under it appears to have been the synagogue from Jesus' time. It dates to the 1st century. They dated it with coins that they found, a stash of coins that all had the same date in the 1st century. It was destroyed likely by the Romans in the First War. And later on, this limestone synagogue was built on top of the foundation of the 1st century synagogue. So while this white building is not the one of Jesus' time, it's sitting on the same space. There are 2 synagogues here. And they teach us, archaeology teaches us some things. The bottom one, the dark colored one, that's, from Jesus' time, it's made of this dark volcanic stone called basalt. It's that dark gray. It's volcanic. It's not very strong, doesn't support a lot of weight. These walls are very thick because the gray walls are very thick, several feet thick because they don't support as much weight. There's not strong rock, but it's local, it's free, it's abundant. And so if you're poor, that's what you build your stuff out of. 1st century bits was made out of this cheap local stone, this dark gray basalt. but it shows the poverty of the town. It's not a great quality stone, but it's what they can afford. It's free or almost free, and it's everywhere. By the way, this also illuminates another story. Remember the paralytic man who was let down through the roof? How often do you take off a roof, of someone's house? That's a pretty big deal. But with these houses built of this cheap, lightweight stone, you can't support a heavy roof. And so it's a lightweight deal to begin with, unlike other parts of the country. And so it's very easy to remove it. And so that kind of plays into that story there. The archaeology illuminates that story, doesn't it? And if it sounds a little incredible going through the roof, in there, not so much. You needed a lightweight roof that didn't require a lot of, it wasn't heavy. But also, it talks about the poverty of the town. The Jews, one time, one of the centurions there, maybe commanding the garrison in there, sends word to Jesus asking if he'll heal his servant. And the people say, hey, this centurion, he's a really nice guy. He loves our people, our nation. He's the one who built our synagogue. Well, why couldn't the Jews build their own synagogue there? Why do they need the donation of a well-off centurion? Probably because they're too poor to build a decent synagogue. It's a poor town. And so this question reflects what we see in the archaeology. The synagogue is made of this cheap stone in the first century. There's no money for anything better. Now, a few centuries later, 3rd, 4th, or 5th centuries, this limestone, that's expensive quality stuff, and they could afford to bring it in from somewhere. In that time, later on, the town was more prosperous, had more wealth. But in the time of Jesus, the archaeology shows, it illuminates this verse, it backs it up. Luke chapter 7, they had to have a centurion build their synagogue for them. They were too poor. And the archaeology backs that up. A very poor town, unlike the later one when they were wealthier, but not in Jesus' time. Of the miracles recorded in Capernaum, we know at least these were done inside the synagogue, not just on the streets somewhere, but in the synagogue. The centurion's servant, the man with the withered hand, the paralytic, a different paralytic heal. Actually, those are in Capernaum. I'm sorry. But look, several of these miracles and one of Jesus' famous sermons in John chapter 6, I'm the bread of life, eat my flesh, drink my blood. The Bible says he said those words in the synagogue in Capernaum. And this is the very same space. Go down a couple, 3 feet, and you're in the first century synagogue, the floor level. And if we know synagogues, the speaker was in the middle and the people sat all around. So we can picture Jesus in this same space, different building, but the same space, teaching and working miracles right here. And archaeology gives us something vivid, high def, 4K quality to illuminate and show that those verses are talking about things that were real. The synagogues, the centurion that was stationed there, the lightweight roofs. Archaeology reveals and confirms all these details and gives us reasons to believe it. Let's go to Jerusalem for a bit. This is a sketch of Jerusalem in Jesus' time, what we know about it. And up there on the top right, that big structure, that big rectangular looking thing on the top right, that's the Temple Mount. The temple is one of the buildings up there, but Herod the Great built a massive platform on top of a mountain. Took a mountain and made it a huge flat space, big enough to hold over 100,000 people. Impressive. And that platform's still there today, in fact. But when Jesus was in the temple, that's where he was, in that area somewhere. And we don't have time to go into much detail. Here is a view of a model of first century Jerusalem that's set up in Jerusalem. If you go there, you may have seen this. This is looking from the right side. The right side is the Mount of Olives, and this is the view looking down from the right side. There's the Temple Mount. You can see the temple in the middle sticking up, the whiter building with gold trim, the other buildings around it, and you can see behind it and below it the rest of Jerusalem, more or less as it appeared in the first century. But that's the setting for a lot of Jesus' works. Today, this is how that view looks. Mount of Olives looking down 2,000 years ago, Mount of Olives looking down today. The rectangular platform is still there. The foundations are all there, but the top's been cleaned off and rebuilt. It's all Islamic buildings now. And you cannot do any archaeology there because Muslims won't permit it. So one of the best places to dig for anything, David, Solomon, even Jesus' time, you cannot dig anywhere on or right by around the Temple Mount. You have to be very careful. A lot of areas are just off limits, so we can't dig in some of the best places for biblical archaeology in Jerusalem. But we can dig other places. Anyway, this is that area, and Jesus walked around in that space, doing all sorts of things. Here's a view of that model again, looking from the south, from the bottom. And we see the entrance on the staircases, those double doors on two different sides going in, and you go up a tunnel and you're inside the temple. So we found there was an illegal excavation carried out a number of years ago by some Muslims who wanted to expand something there. They dug up a bunch of dirt and stuff without telling anyone, without getting permission, and just dumped it out in the valley. Well, some archaeologists went and got all that dirt, and they've been sifting it slowly ever since. And a lot of volunteers can go there and sift. It's very limited as far as what you can get from it, because it's all been taken out and mixed up and jumbled, and you can't connect, locations or levels. But they found a lot of pieces of things that were on the Temple Mount from different time periods. One thing they learned is that sections of the Temple Mount floor looks like this. They found a lot of pieces. These are restored. Some of the pieces are, if you see the faded out ones are original pieces. The darker colors are reconstructions to fit in the gaps. But sections of the floor, when you walk on the Temple Mount, some areas look like this. And so it shows you what it gives you. It helps you see things as Jesus and the apostles saw them. Gets us a little closer to their perspective. Here's inside the temple model. And you would come up from those tunnels coming in most of the time, and you have these big colonnades around the sides. And people, these columned areas, they're shady, they echo very well. So when people were teaching and talking on the Temple Mount, they're usually inside those areas. It's cooler, it's in the shade, and people can hear better. And so when we picture Jesus or Peter teaching, or Christians meeting on the Temple Mount, probably more often than not, they were inside these areas, and it helps us get a picture. It also is consistent with what we know. They spent time, they could do these things. There was a space for that, for the things they did. Here's a passage that talks about Jesus healing someone. John chapter 9, there's a blind man, and Jesus spits on the ground, makes mud, sticks mud in his eyes, and tells him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." And the blind man went and washed and came back seeing. Well, we have something on that. Here's the model, that model of first century Jerusalem. The Temple Mount's up there, and there's a street that comes on down. We call it the Siloam Street, and it comes down to that little boxy thing down there, the Pool of Siloam. How do we know where it was? Because we found it. There are several clues that help us pin the location, but it was found accidentally back around 2005, I think, if I remember correctly. And these are the steps of the Pool of Siloam, and some of it's been excavated, not all of it. It's private property. But here's some of the street coming down. It was a stepped street, and the blind man went down from probably hanging out near the temple, went down the stepped street, washed in the Pool of Siloam, walked down this way on this path. Maybe not these exact stones. We do know that Jerusalem was repaved right before everything was destroyed. About 3 decades after Jesus' time, all the streets started to be repaved. So the stones may have been replaced. We don't know for sure if the blind man was on these stones, but the ones who were here before, possibly, if they were replaced. Anyway, we have the street, the location, and we have the pool. And so we have a place where Jesus healed someone. And that miracle doesn't put Jesus in the pool, but it has Jesus sending the blind man to the pool. And Jesus knew what the pool was. He probably was here too, on this very area. And the water was in the left there, coming up over a number of those steps. This is a busy, active place during the time of Jesus and the apostles. And we found it. And during very heavy rains, this thing can actually flood and hold water, even still today. But it's not really clean, all that mud down there. You don't want to wash in that. But we have a place, and it fills it. It's a place mentioned in the Bible. It existed, and it connects in the way the story presents it. So archaeology gives us things like that. The text in John tells us in chapter 5 of another pool near the sheep gate, a pool which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. And that sounds odd until we actually found the pool by that gate in the area there. Archaeology dug it up, and we figured out, why 5? Is it like a pentagon shape? That's weird. We never found that anywhere else in that time period. But turns out there's an upper and lower pool with a middle divider. And so you had the 4 sides, and then the one splitting it down the middle, 5 colonnades. And Jesus had a story there. Those steps in the very bottom are original steps from that pool from the 1st century. So Jesus might have walked on those steps, those very steps right there. He at least would have seen them, no doubt, if he didn't even walk on them. Archaeology pinpoints places the Bible talks about. They existed. They're in the places and fit the story as it says they would. Well, how about Jesus' death? where was he crucified and buried? Now, it's like his birth, just what do we expect to find? Well, there are two different locations that are popular. Now, unlike his birth, the Bible actually does give us some information on where he was killed. The Bible doesn't really give us much detail on his birthplace, but it gives us a lot on his death, on the site of his death, Golgotha. What does it tell us? It's nicknamed the place of the skull. Aramaic for that is Golgotha. They crucified him there, and it mentions the skull. So why would they call it a skull? Maybe it looks like one. Maybe it's because they're executions. We don't know. We have to guess, but maybe that's a clue anyway. It was near the city. And it was outside the gate in Jesus' time. So it was not, inside, it was outside, which makes sense. You don't kill people. Jews didn't kill people inside the city, outside the camp. He was buried in a brand new tomb, a Roman period tomb, cut into the rock, and a great stone in the entrance. There was a garden also at that place where that new tomb was. So we have several things to help us. Now, one popular location that's been proposed is this one. It's called Gordon's Cavalry. And it wasn't proposed really until the 1700s by a guy over there. And then a British officer in the 1800s popularized it because he thought he was drinking tea one day and looked at some angle and thought he saw the rock looked like a skull. And so, oh, that looks like a skull from my angle. Maybe that's the place of the skull where Jesus was crucified. Maybe this is Calvary. Maybe this is Golgotha. And it's taken on, and a lot of people today still go there, venerating it as Jesus' crucifixion site. The thing is, it's not his place. And we can kind of demonstrate that. If you look kind of where that rock is, maybe you can see some gaps and slits that almost look a little bit skull-like. Kind of hard. Here's a picture of it back like 100 or more years ago. And that's the feature that looked kind of like a skull. Maybe you can see the eyes and maybe a nose. But if you look at it, it's eroded. It doesn't look the same anymore. Which raises the question, if it's eroded this much in 100 years, what happened to it in the 1800 years between Jesus' time and the time when that British officer proposed it? Did it look the same? And the answer is it probably changed its appearance a good bit. And that's a big assumption to say that the place of the skull must mean this feature. It's possible, but it erodes and it changes its appearance as it erodes. And so here's the tomb. So there's a tomb there. And here's the tomb, and people go inside the tomb of Jesus. The problem is, what did the Bible say about the tomb? It was a new one, which means it hadn't been used before. The design would be like other tombs in the Roman period. This tomb turns out dates to the time of the kings of Judah in the Old Testament. It was already hundreds of years old by the time of Jesus. Archaeologists excavated the tomb, and the layout, the design, the fragments of the pottery they found inside, it was hundreds of years old in Jesus' time, so it's definitely not it. People still go there. Christians go there and are told sometimes this is it, and yet it can't be. There's a rolling stone there, but the thing is, it was brought in from a different tomb somewhere else to make it look more photogenic, more tomb-like for Jesus. So that's not actually connected with that tomb. Watch out. But there's one more place proposed, and it's not pretty or photogenic, but it's these two gray domes in the middle of Jerusalem's old city. It's an old building, not pretty, kind of ugly, but it's probably the spot where Jesus was crucified. Here's the entrance right there. Again, kind of underwhelming, isn't it? And it probably is because this spot, we know it's been excavated, and we have records as well. During the time of Jesus, it was outside the walls. This area was a quarry. It was actually an Old Testament era quarry from the time of the kings, and it was still there, being used apparently, probably as an execution site in the time of Jesus. It was outside the walls. There are tombs there from the Roman period. And so it has tombs that would have been fairly new around the time they were built in the time of Jesus, or around the time of Jesus, which is one of the things you look for. Excavations turned up an area with a lot of black soil that's not typical of the area, seeds, someone brought in garden dirt from somewhere else, and we found evidence of vegetation of other plants. There was a garden around that area. We actually have archaeological evidence of that. And there's a very strong tradition from very early times. After Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, the city was rebuilt. Actually, it was rebuilt partially, and then in the Second War, about half a century later, the city was totally destroyed, and the Roman Emperor Hadrian filled in that whole area and built a Roman temple on top of it. Well, it sat there for about 200 years, And then it was torn down by Constantine's mom, who Constantine was a Christian. And she was there visiting and asked the local Christians, do we know where our Lord was crucified? And all the local Christians said, yes. See that area? There used to be a temple there that Hadrian built. Underneath that is a rock that was used for executions, and that's where Golgotha is. This was 200 years after it's been buried and invisible. But Christians preserved that story, that memory over generations, 200 years of generations. And they went and dug it all up, and there was a rock there, just like they said. And we have these other things, the garden nearby, and there were Roman tombs there. And so there's a very good argument to be made that this is probably it. Now, of course, it doesn't tell us, he was the Son of God or they rose from the dead, but it tells us the things we'd expect to find in an excavation. If it gives us information that help us. Inside the church itself is very depressing. Always idols, icons, and images. That rock right there is the rock that's talked about, which traditionally in that local memory was where Jesus was crucified, honored or by it or something. It's all covered up now in glass cases. You can see it, and you can get on your knees and under that little table and touch it with your hand, if you're into that sort of thing. The tomb they identified as Jesus' tomb, we really didn't know, but they took one of the tombs and cut everything else away and built a big thing over it, and that's Jesus' traditional tomb. We don't know for sure if that was his tomb. It was a Roman tomb, though, from what we can tell. But there are other Roman tombs nearby. If you know where to look, there's an area you can crawl in, and there's a first century tomb in the Roman style. And what were these niches used for? When someone dies, you bury him in there. If any of you know David McClister, that's him demonstrating the proper use of a Roman tomb in the first century. And so you lay them there for a year, then collect their bones and put it in the bone box, right? But so it matches everything we know. And so that it supports the description of the place of Jesus' death. It gives a lot of geographical and physical details. And we found a place that matches all of it. And the local memory remembered it centuries later as the place as well. That's pretty impressive. It all lines up. One more question and we'll conclude. This is not about Jesus, but about the next chapter. Acts chapter 2 talks about people being baptized, and afterward, people were baptized into Jesus. That's how you become a Christian. Well, a lot of cities are located on a river or on a lake, and if you baptize, just go down to the river, right? Jerusalem has no river. Jerusalem has no lake, no pond. It's in the mountains with no big water source like that. So the question is, where do you baptize people in Jerusalem, especially in Acts chapter 2? What is it? 3,000 people in one day? Well, that's a lot of, you need a lot of water for that, a place where you can be very efficient with your baptismal time. Where can you do that? Archaeology gives us an answer. So we know from Jewish tradition and from the Bible that Jews in the first century were very serious about washing. They were always washing their hands. And there's a comment here in Mark 7 about how the Pharisees and Jews don't eat unless they wash their hands a certain way. And their traditions, they're washing all the time. And they have traditions for washing all sorts of things. If you're an observant Jew, you wash things and you wash yourself frequently. And observant Jews still do today. The first century it was happening. So you need a place, you need a lot with water, place you can wash. And Jews in that time period, and even some observant Jews today, made little pools called a mikveh. A mikveh. It's just a small baptismal pool. It's all it is. And you see the stairs with a little divider. You go down one side, immerse yourself, and come up the other side. Observant Jews do it today. And observant Jews did it 2,000 years ago. For the past 2,000 years, anywhere you find an observant Jewish community, there's a mikveh somewhere, because they do that before they pray. They do that before they go in the synagogue, before they approach God on the high holy days. They do it. They're always immersing themselves in these things. And we found a ton of these in archaeology. Here's a mikveh up in Magdala. And you see this would have been filled with water, at least halfway or so. Here's my daughter a few years ago who went, and about 3 years ago, and she's standing in a mikveh in Magdala. They would go and immerse themselves in this before going in the synagogue. If Jesus visited the synagogue in Magdala, he was a Jewish man. He would have immersed himself. Maybe Jesus used this very mikveh. It's possible. The Bible talks about Paul purifying himself in Acts, I believe it's chapter 20. Before he goes into the temple and before he's arrested, he purified himself. That means he immersed himself in a mikveh. So the Bible even talks about this practice. Here's one right next to the Temple Mount. That wall behind up there, that's actually the side of the Temple Mount itself. And you see the mikveh. You go down one side and go up the other side when you're clean. There's a barrier so you don't bump people and get unclean again. Here's another one and another one. This one has some standing water in it from rain. And so when we come to Acts chapter 2, be baptized in the name of Jesus, immersed. And there are those who received his word were immersed, about 3,000 souls. Where do you do it? I think we know now. Where do you baptize 3,000 people in Jerusalem? Archaeology has found over 100 mikvahs around the Temple Mount, like this one, and like this one. And here's a big one. Look at that, 4-sided mikvah. That's just right below the Temple Mount, just barely south. These are probably places where some of those 3,000 people were baptized. And we have an explanation for that now. Archaeology has given us an explanation. Where do you baptize thousands of people in Jerusalem? And archaeology shows us that. And so we see just some of the things archaeology can reveal about all of this. We already talked about that. Is Jesus the Son of God? Archaeology can't answer that. That's a question to be answered in other ways. We have every reason to believe Jesus lived on earth, and the archaeology shows the material culture, the buildings, the locations, the infrastructure, all that is fully consistent with everything we see described in the New Testament. The places, the physical descriptions, the way things fit together, archaeology backs every bit of it up. We can place our confidence that the New Testament portrays things accurately, and we can show that with archaeology. And this gives us good reasons to put our faith in Jesus. If we can trust the Bible on all these physical details we can see, maybe we can trust it on the things that we cannot yet see, the things that require faith. And if we can't trust it on the things we can see, how can we trust the invisible things? But we can easily choose to trust what it says about the invisible things, because everything that is visible is consistent. Again, here's my blog, my website. If you want to visit, I update it from time to time with archaeological information, and some people find it interesting, and you can get updates and stay in tune with a lot of the archaeological discoveries and maybe some things we can learn from them about our faith, about people and situations in the Bible. Well, if anything about this has led you to reconsider your relationship with Jesus, to come to him in some way, please do that. We have faith. He's the Lord and our Savior. And the Bible gives us good reasons to put our faith in him. Be saved from this world. The year 2020 reminds us what a broken world this is. Be saved from this and respond to Jesus. If you need to, contact someone to help you become a Christian, to be baptized in the local mikveh, maybe in your church building, or wherever. But the elders in the Jamestown Church are willing to help and talk with you if you'd like. The email is elders@jamestowncoc.com. And with this, I'll turn it over to Corey Willis for questions. And if you have any, he'll talk about ways to handle that and to get your question read.
Well, Luke, thank you again. Another wonderful night, a great lesson there of things that we were able to see, and so cool to see them and hear you talk about them as well. As we've been doing each of the nights, we'll have a period here of question and answer. A couple ways that you can ask questions. You can chat them in, and I'll make sure to moderate them so Luke can hear them. And you also have the option, as he mentioned at the beginning, to use Zoom, to choose the raise your hand feature. You'll find that in the participant panel of your Zoom dialogue there, and you can raise your hand. I can actually then unmute you and let you ask that question over audio. So to get things started here, we have a question about ossuaries. Recently, somewhat, Luke, I remember there was some discussion about a famous ossuary that was found. Is there still a controversy over that ossuary? Could you tell us more about that?
The question is which one. I don't know which one is being referred to. One that comes to mind
one
is
that was claimed to be James, the
Yes.
brother of Jesus. Sorry about that.
That was the first one I was going to mention. That was there's an ossuary that's labeled James, and it says brother of Jesus. And the brother of Jesus, is this the ossuary of James, the brother of Jesus? And in the end, we don't know for sure. And I don't think we'll ever be able to know for sure. The handwriting of the inscription, it's two different hands. The first person wrote in the name of James, then a different hand, you can tell by the handwriting, a different hand wrote brother of Jesus. And so, why? We can just speculate. Maybe someone knew it was and thought it'd be important to include that. We don't know. But one problem is that, popular names, how can you identify it as the James? Unfortunately, during all the process of taking it, it was confiscated at one point, subjected to some tests, and some unthinking person in a laboratory filled the inscription with a certain substance to get an impression and ripped it out, and it ripped out some of the rock in the testable surface inside there, which takes away our ability to run scientific tests or analysis on the actual inscription. Some think it may have come from that Jesus family tomb. There are some mineralogical similarities with the stone. Doesn't prove it. It could just show it came from the same area. But so in the end, it's possible, but we just don't know for sure. And we probably never will.
I hadn't heard that update. That's unfortunate to hear that. Again, if you have other questions, chat those in. One of the things I was thinking as we were looking here, Jesus was, the son of a carpenter, practiced as a carpenter himself. What did that mean then, Luke? I didn't see a whole lot of trees around there, and I've heard speculation that may not have meant the same kind of carpenter we think of, but I'd like to hear your thoughts and comments on that.
Sure. The word that's translated carpenter is tekton, and it really translates better as a builder. We might think of it as a contractor today. As you've noticed, there aren't a lot of trees there. There were trees back in the time of Joshua and the Israelites, but deforestation and just the fact that all the things we find, so everything's built out of stone. In antiquity and today, stone comprises 95% of everything that's built or more. Carpenter, I believe it comes from the King James translation or the early English translations. In England, they used wood for a lot more. And when you're a builder in England, you build things out of wood, and a carpenter. But more likely, he was a contractor. And there's a city near Nazareth called Sepphoris. It's on the map. It's not mentioned in the New Testament, but it's just a couple hours walk from Nazareth. We know from history the entire city of Sepphoris was rebuilt when Jesus was a teenager, 20 years old, something like that. So it's very possible Jesus and his father were contracted to take part in that reconstruction, which is sort of neat to think about. There has been some archaeology there in Sepphoris, and so maybe you can look at some things they worked on.
Fantastic. Well, a couple other chatted questions have come in here. Bob Staten chatted in, recognizing the writings of Tacitus and Josephus, it appears the best method of the use of archaeology to prove Jesus is to prove the accuracy and historicity or his history noted in the Bible, which ultimately proves the biblical account of Jesus. Is that a fair way to handle the things that we're finding here? You mentioned a lot, making sure we don't mishandle these things. So I'd like to hear your comments on that as well.
I think that's basically accurate. I personally don't use the word prove, because prove is a standard which you can demonstrate something, and repeat it. And you really can't prove anything in history in that sense. And with archaeology, you really can't either. Most archaeologists avoid the word prove. They're just trained to avoid it because it's just leftovers. And you always have some level of assumption. Sometimes it's a very safe assumption. Sometimes, there's a lot more guesswork behind the assumption. But I think that statement is generally true. In the case of Jesus, our artifacts for him are documents, and the archaeology, illuminates those literary sources.
Very good. Appreciate those thoughts. Mark and Rita here, Newton chat in. Is it true that Peter's house might be known in Capernaum because it's joined to the synagogue?
It's not joined to the synagogue, but it's very, very close to the synagogue. And I didn't mention that tonight because just pick and choose. But there is a house there that early on was venerated by Christians as the house of Peter. And today there's a big building a big chapel. Looks kind of like a UFO or a big helicopter pad built on top of it to preserve the ruins and also to give people a place, if they want to pray or something, an air-conditioned place to do it where they won't be able to just pick stuff off the ruins either. There's a house there, and it dates to the 1st century. We have records from early pilgrims of who passed through the Holy Lands in the time of the Byzantines or the late Romans, and they talk about seeing the house of Peter. And so we have a record of what were they talking about? And archaeologically, we found this building, and it was several stages. Basically, to simplify it, it was originally a house that was expanded into a bigger meeting place, then expanded again into a church building on the very same spot. Whenever they expanded, they never changed location. They always kept it right there at the very same spot. There's Christian graffiti inside. And when they expanded, they tore down other houses in order to keep using this same place. So why'd they do that? There's a reason for it. And the tradition very early is that it's Peter's house. Peter and his mother-in-law, when Jesus healed his mother-in-law, was there. Maybe Jesus was living in Peter's house when he lived in Capernaum. We don't. That's a bit of a guess, but it's a pretty reasonable assumption that it may have been Peter's house, that it preserved that local memory. And you can go see it today. You can't touch it or walk through it, but you can look at it and see, if someone's there to explain it, you can see the different expansions and see how it grew over time. And there's some good signage to illustrate that too.
Very cool. Very cool. One of the things that was texted into me during the presentation was asking about the homes. At one point, a picture was there with a manger, feeding trough there, and somebody chatted in, is that a cave? Tell us what homes were like during the 1st century. The traditional view that we have of a home being stick built and all those. How did the home and where did the animals live and all those things? Give me a sense of what that was at that time.
In the time of Jesus, some of that depends on where you are. We found examples in, like, under one of the modern church buildings in Nazareth, there's a small cave that was used as a house. And so like a house cave. And so some people did that, but also a few years ago, someone in Nazareth was building a new, like a bank or a store. I think it was a bank. And they, in clearing the land, found foundations of a structure, a house structure from that same time period. Now they excavated it, then they covered the whole thing up and built the bank or whatever it was anyway. So there's nothing for us to see. But they were made of, whatever they were made of stone. If you're poor, you might have a house cave. If you have a little bit of money, you might actually build a stone house. And if you have a decent amount of money, you might have a couple of levels on your house. And the animals, if sometimes you keep animals on the first level and people sleep on the second level, or even sleep on the roof, because most of the year it's comfortable at night and dry enough, and that's an option for you. But we're talking stone dwellings with plaster to make it watertight and insect proof, or at least more so. And a little more cramped, but some of the houses might be a little bigger than we might imagine, we might assume. Some of them were relatively spacious.
Very good. A couple other questions have come in here. Bob Staten asks, is it common to find bones in ossuaries during the digs that are happening from season to season? How often does that happen?
Yes, a lot of the ossuaries have bones in them. Maybe most of them. We found all sorts of ossuaries and lots of bones. The bones are typically reburied if they're believed to be Jewish. Out of respect, there's like a Jewish ceremony before they're reinterred somewhere else. But yeah, the bones are frequently there. The only example of crucifixion we've ever found was in an ossuary. And there's a replica. If you go to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, there's a replica on display of a heel bone with a nail through it. Not from the top like paintings you should do, not like this, but from the side. And if you've been to that museum, you've likely seen it. Again, that's a replica on display, but it was found in an ossuary. And so they've taught us a lot.
Wow. The other question that came in from Dennis and Tanya Boone, are there Christians in Israel today?
If we're talking about New Testament Christians, there are a handful. There's a very small church in Nazareth, and there are a few Christians that meet in the city of Ramallah in Palestinian territory. I've not been with either group, in part because I'm never there. I've never been in Nazareth over a weekend on a Sunday. Otherwise, I would try to get with those people there. I believe they are, I guess we might say, aligned on the institutional side of issues, but I don't really know that that issue is understood in that way. I don't personally know any of the people there. I know people who do. The ones in Ramallah, I know they're there, but I also know of an American who was there one time a few years ago and tried to connect with them. And this was just after Donald Trump moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And the Christians there told the American to not bother showing up because he's an American, and they were upset. So politics pervades a lot of things over there, even more so than here.
All right, very good. We have another question in here from Julian and Lydia Owens asking, were the synagogues there typically enclosed, or were they open air?
They were enclosed because winter's a rainy season. Israel does get a lot of rain between Octoberish and April in a typical year, and so they were enclosed.
Very good. Well, Luke, you've done well with the questions every night. You know, I never think we're going to stump you, and I really hope we don't. So appreciate you taking those. And as we've done about this time each night, tomorrow night, Thursday night, is the incredible biblical discoveries or not. And you have talked about the potential of fake archaeology. Give us a sense of what we expect to hear tomorrow night.
All right. Well, it's not aliens built the pyramids. No, it's not that. Though it could be. That is an example of fake. That's not really archaeology. It's science fiction. And fake archaeology works a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's a blatant fake, like people who tell you things, these artifacts here, like these things on the ocean floor relate to the Exodus. No, they don't. That's fake. Some people, Noah's Ark, have we found it? Well, apparently we found it in several different places. But of course, that's problematic. Some of that is intentionally fraud. Some of it's well-intentioned, not fraud, but just to date, no one. Well, I'm not going to get into that. We're going to talk about Noah's Ark and just some cautions, and with archaeology in general. And we're going to talk a little bit about media, Mount Sinai, documentaries, videos. Be careful how to recognize the fakes and not use archaeology in a way that bounces back, that snaps back, and gives critics reasons to criticize us.
Looking forward to that. I actually had another message come in from one of our younger members, Knox Davis, one of the children at church here. He asked, readers are dying to know.
The sound went out a bit. Could you repeat?
Oh, no. I said, Knox Davis asked, did you ever find any dinosaur bones during one of your digs?
I have not. I'll tell you, if I did, that would make news. I'll tell you that. And I would like to one of these days, maybe, but probably not at the kinds of digs I'm doing.
Oh, very good. Well, for all of those who have asked questions, appreciate those. Again, Luke, thank you so much for your time tonight. We're looking forward to the next 2 nights that we have. I can't believe we're nearing the end already. So a lot of great content here, and appreciate everything you've put into it, the time that we're able to spend together. As we've done, we'll close out tonight in a word of prayer. So if you would, bow with me and let's pray to God together as we close out. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for the day that you've given us. We thank you, God, for the word that is so clearly spelled out for us, that we can understand who you are and how man compares to you, that we are sinful creatures who have done so intentionally, and yet nonetheless you have sent your Son that we can have our sins forgiven, that we can stand before you justified by your doing, not our own. We thank you tonight for the things we've heard and consider about your Son, as we know that this was a real event, real happenings in a real place. And Father, we are able to see these evidences that give us the understanding that they did happen. And help us, God, as we talk to others about the gospel, to have that confidence that these are not stories, but rather narratives of things that actually occurred. Father, as we are out among those at work and those at school, help us to look for those opportunities to bring men to you, to teach your gospel, to demonstrate a life of Christ, that they might see something about the way that we live as well, that they might come to you. In all these things, God, we pray that you'll be glorified in the things that we say and the way that we live. We ask, Father, that you'll bless those who have participated this evening. Again, that if there's something amiss in their life that stands between them and you and the salvation that lies ahead, that we'll have restless sleep, God, knowing that those things need to be resolved. And help us, God, to every opportunity tackle those issues in our lives that separate us from you, and that we can become more like you. We thank you, God, most of all, for Jesus, your Son, for that sacrifice and for the opportunity that we have to be in heaven together forever. It's in the name of Jesus the Christ that we pray. Amen.